the question becomes, can India also fulfill the promise that India represents in some way? Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that India is perhaps unusual, maybe even unique among the rising great powers. If you think of a Brazil, you think of an Indonesia, certainly you think of China, in that it is a country that also stands for something. It is not just an emerging nation that has become more and more powerful and economically competent and militarily strong. It's the biggest democracy in the world. It's a country that in many ways reflects some of the most important values of this liberal international order that I was describing. And in that way, it is different, I think, from a Brazil or an Indonesia, though both of them are democracies. Because India has been a democracy from the start. It was a democracy when there were very few poor countries that were democracies. And it has managed to maintain that democracy with one brief interruption for its entire independent existence. And that means it has perhaps a special role to play, given the context I was outlining in terms of where we stand. India could play a role as one of the key redefiners, recreators of this liberal international order, an order that would be based not just on might makes right, not just on spheres of influence, but on the idea of some certain values as well. And it's perfectly poised to do that because it has this rich tradition behind it. The challenge, of course, is that India, in its own way, has been straying from those very traditions. This is not, my opinion. If you look at the three institutes that rank democracies, that rate democracies around the world, all three of them show significant democratic decay or slippage in India. I think two of them place India in almost a zone where it would be an illiberal democracy. And if you look at the measures they're looking at, they're hard to argue with. Independence of the judiciary, independence of courts, all kinds of things that usually constitute the kind of inner stuffing of democracy have been moving in a difficult direction in India for the last 10 or 15 years. And so the challenge becomes, can an India that is experiencing some democratic slippage or reversal play this role in upholding a broader international order? I believe it can. And I think it can for a variety of reasons. To begin with, you don't have to be perfect to believe in some of these values and to uphold some of these values. Let's remember that the United States that created that international order was a United States that was actively and aggressively practicing Jim Crow in the South. That the man who conceived of this international order, Franklin Roosevelt, had never confronted his own party on Jim Crow in the South and all the associated inequities that it involved. And it's simply a way to remember that, nobody is perfect. No country has ever been able to completely fulfill the aspirations of some of these ideas, and certainly no country that is very powerful. I often say that you have to compare the United States' reign as the leading power in the world, not with Costa Rica, but with the other leading powers of their time, and ask, if you're trying to figure out how well the United States has done, the Soviet Union, the Kaiser's Germany, Hitler's Germany, Imperial France, Imperial Britain. And India, in that sense, is a mixed bag right now. There are some areas where when I look at India, it's extraordinarily dynamic. There are things to be incredibly proud of and to look at with extraordinary, almost awe, the way in which India is able to move fast and quickly, the way in which it has been able to reform some of the parts of both the economy and even the bureaucratic and political systems that seemed impossible to imagine being done. You go to Bombay, and I do still call it Bombay, Ashu. You go to Bombay now, the extraordinary build out of infrastructure in Bombay is almost Chinese in its speed and efficiency. But you do have the reality I was describing, and there I think my hope for India comes from the reality that India is a very big, complicated place in which many things are happening at the same time. So you do have some of this democratic slippage, but you also have a country with enormous pluralism and vitality and civil and civic engagement at every level. And I think this may be, my own hope and perhaps even sense of India, prediction about India, is that the power of that internal pluralism and dynamism and bottom-up civic activism will, over time, ensure that Indian democracy doesn't move from greater illiberalism to illiberal democracy and then to authoritarianism. I think a country with so many different political regions, linguistic regions, caste differences, religious differences, is going to be very hard to run as a single monolithic country by one centralized regime. And if you look at the kind of cultural basis of Indian life, Hinduism, it feels to me as a non-Hindu, but as somebody who grew up as a minority in India, that the defining feature of Hinduism is its tolerance. I can think of no other major world religion in which you could say you can be a vegetarian and consider yourself a strict Hindu, and you can be a non-vegetarian and consider yourself a strict Hindu. You can worship one God or 300 and consider that to be the absolute requirement of your religion. Hinduism has an extraordinary absorptive power. When you think about it, this is a country in which Buddhism was created, where Buddha comes from. And yet, it's the one country where basically there are no Buddhists, because Hinduism just absorbed it. And said, oh, wait, you want to believe in non-violence? We believe in that too. You want to believe in not killing animals? We believe in that too. You can do it wherever, it can incorporate almost any element of it, because it is defined almost by its tolerance and pluralism. And for a religion like that, which is really more a philosophy of life, to take on an exclusionary, intolerant, but a kind of worldview or patina seems to me ultimately not what the DNA of India is, and not what the DNA of Hinduism is. And I say this, with humility as an outsider, but as somebody who lived and saw that reality in the India that I grew up in, which was, I think, considerably more pluralistic and tolerant and secular than at times it has seemed today. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not one of these people who believes there was ever a golden age anywhere. The Bombay I grew up in had religious riots, very, very bad religious riots. People, coming to my door. But it also had enormous cultural tolerance, pluralism, and synergy. And when I came to America, I remember telling people that to me the big difference seemed that the America I was in, people tolerated each other's religions. In India, the India I grew up in, people celebrated each other's religions. We would go and celebrate Diwali and Holi. Our friends would come and celebrate Eid. Everyone celebrated Christmas. My uncle, in fact, who later on became an imam, used to be the Santa Claus because he had the big beard. He didn't have to get a fake one, and that was the kind of the India that I remember, and I think it's not just memory. There was a great deal to it, and so to my mind, if that India becomes more and more powerful on the world stage and articulates some of these values that are core to what it is as in its own way, then India can be a model for this new emerging world order, and it can help define this new emerging world order as one that doesn't involve a move to narrow nationalism, exclusion, and conflict, but instead one that represents more. And in many ways, India is a much more understandable model for most countries in the world. When I go around the world, and this is particularly was true about 5 or 7 years ago, you go anywhere in the world. I mean, I remember once even going to Iran and being told this by an official. We want to be like China. And what all of these countries meant by that is we want to maintain our dictatorship, but we want to get rich. And the trouble with that is it's very, very hard to do. There are very few countries that have figured out how to be extremely pro-market, extremely efficient, and extremely Leninist at the same time. That is a very, very complicated balancing act that the Chinese have managed to do, which very, very few other countries have. India, by contrast, is an open, messy, chaotic democracy, which somehow has managed in the openness, chaos, and democratic process to also grow pretty fast. When people will often moan about India, it's not growing as fast as China, which is true, and it will never grow as fast as China. China has had the fastest growth of any large economy in the history of the world, and it will not be equaled by India. But India has been the second fastest growing large economy in the world for the last 25 years. So it's not a bad record. If you compare it to the other 195 countries in the world, it's not China. And I think that in some ways, it's much more approachable. It's much more manageable. If you're a developing country and trying to figure out how to grow, you're going to find more interesting lessons that you can copy from an India than you are from a China. And India, in that sense, can play a much larger and broader role. The question is, does India want to play that role? I mean, India has been unusually reticent over the last 3 or 4 decades to play a larger part in the world. In the 1950s and 60s, India was willing to make stirring speeches in the United Nations. I think of Nehru and Krishnamurti and people like that, but do very little. It was all rhetoric, often very self-righteous rhetoric, but it didn't go anywhere. Now it has taken on a much more practical cast, which I think is a reflection, perhaps, of the recognizing that Nehruvian era and the high-minded rhetoric got it very little. But it might be time for India to step up and start articulating its vision of the world and not simply try to make sure that it can cut a good deal with the United States and with Russia. And that vision, to my mind, would be one where India would have recognized that its destiny really lies with the West. First of all, there's a practical reality. India's economy is a much more natural partner for the Western economies of the world. It is a high consumption, consumer-led economy in very much the same way that the United States is. India is not a predatory export-led state economy, which is going to play a role that inevitably involves a certain degree of tension with the Western world, as you can see even now with China, as its excess manufacturing goods flood markets, not just in Europe, but in Southeast Asia. It produces an inevitable tension between that country. India is a much more open, consumer-led economy, largely driven at the high end by services. All of this is very compatible with the way in which Western economies work, and you could imagine a much greater degree of synergy. It's also true that India much more easily can be integrated into the West. Not every Indian speaks English, a mistake that many tourists make when they go, but a large number do. About 15% of the country speaks it. It means that there is a natural ability to integrate into the Western world. There is a large Indian diaspora in the West, which helps in that way. But more importantly, there is this alignment of values. In India, in its DNA, is part of this liberal world that believes in universal values. India has always articulated itself as believing in those. It just doesn't do it consistently. It doesn't do it loudly, but it is very much. If you were to ask an Indian what India stands for, it would be those kind of things. And in that sense, India has more of that sense of proselytizing than, say, a China. If you think about the difference between the United States and China in terms of its world role, the United States does have this high Protestant proselytizing mentality, which says, when you go to a place like Iraq, we want Iraqis to become just like Americans. We want them to become capitalists and democrats, and we're going to transform that country. And you see echoes of that even in Iran today. If only we could get rid of the mullahs. They're all, the country is going to be transformed. We can't help it. That is in our DNA. The Chinese have no such conception. But the Chinese look at a country like Iran or Iraq, they would say they can never be Chinese because they're not Chinese. It is an entirely ethno-nationalist conception of what it means to play a role in the world. China's goal is to make China great, you can't transform other countries into China because they're not ethnically Chinese. I mean, it's two very different visions. And I think that India, being big and plural and messy and democratic and liberal, is actually closer to the American conception than to the Chinese conception. And so my hope has always been that India will be able to recognize that its destiny lies with the West. It would be good for India, good for its internal organization, but also good for the world. And I think it would be a powerful legacy for India to leave the world. It would be maybe too dramatic, too hopeful, and too extravagant to say you could imagine a world that went from English hegemony to American hegemony to Indian hegemony, having then had three liberal superpowers that define the world. But it's an aspiration that I can't help thinking about. The title of the speech, A New Star Rises, comes from Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech, which as a young boy, because my father was a politician, we used to hear this in the background of my house the way that my kids listen to Taylor Swift. And so even now, even though I don't think I've ever read the speech, I can still probably recite certainly the first paragraphs of it from memory. But when reading it for this talk, I noticed that a little bit further down in the speech, Nehru talks about a new star rising in the East. And he says it is a star of freedom. And so even there, right in the great founding document of India, is a reference to India's rise, but also to its values. And my hope is that what you see is not just an India rise, but it rising, holding its values intact for itself and the world. Thank you.